From a base coat of Chaos Black spray, overpainted with a thin layer of Abaddon Black, the first edge highlight is completed with Incubi Darkness, aiming to do a thick edge highlight on all the edges and corners on the model. Examples here where you have surfaces on the hand where you can't use the edge of the brush, drag it as straight lines, but where possible try to use the edge of the brush, as this tends to give a more even finish and is also much quicker. When it comes to the inner edges of the shoulder pauldrons, there isn't really an easy way of doing it other than dragging as straight lines, but you can always correct any thicker lines with Abaddon Black afterwards. The second highlight then is completed with Thunderhawk Blue. In the second highlight, still aim to cover pretty much all the areas, but paint thinner lines within the boundaries of the underpainted Incubi Darkness. Take your time with this step, and if you overspill, again you can correct with the previous colour. Note to pick out any rivets with this colour as well. Complete the black armour with a fine edge highlight on the most prominent corners and edges using Fenrisian Grey. Examples here are things like the tips of the fingers and the sharp corners. Noting that less is more in this case. If you do too much of this very bright colour, you start losing the effect of it being black armour. It tends more to look like Tron. If that's what you're going for, highlight away, but I would suggest less is more. And again, remember picking out the rivets with the Fenrisian Grey as well to make them stand out from the rest of the armour. For the undersuit, pick out the raised edges of it using Mechanicus Standard Grey. You could of course go with a second thinner highlight of something like Administratum Grey at this point, but because the armour is already black, any additional highlighting this might take from the effect. So a single highlight with Mechanicus Standard Grey should be fine. Out the shoulder pauldrons in white using Corax White. Even though this is a base paint, coverage of white over black is generally quite poor, so multiple layers are going to be needed, keeping them thin. In this case I think I used 4, maybe even 5 layers, but because this is the most prominent colour aside from the black on the armour, it's well worth taking the time to give a smooth finish. Pick out all the metallic areas with Iron Hand Steel. In this example I painted the chest Aquila in Iron Hand Steel as well, but I think this can either be a bone colour or a gold colour as well, depending on what artwork you look at. Whichever works, and actually later in this tutorial I paint the gold Aquila on the gun, so you could use that method for the larger chest eagle as well. Shade all of the silver areas using Nuln Oil. Edge highlight then all the silver areas using Stormhost Silver. Paint the gun casing red using Mephiston Red. I find this colour tends to actually have not the best coverage, but it does a great finish, so I would say 2 if even 3 thin coats will be needed for this step. Pick out the rivets with the recessed shade of Agrax Earthshade. Edge highlight the gun with Wild Rider Red, using the edge of the brush of course where possible, but in areas where you can't, just be slow and steady with the brush strokes, and pick out all the rivets on the gun in this colour as well. Pick out the sharpest edges of corners or the rivets on the gun using Fire Dragon Bright in small amounts. Paint the Aquila on the gun with Retributor Armour. Shade the gold with Guilliman Flesh contrast. Edge highlight the gold using Liberator Gold. In this small example I just picked out the middle of the forehead of the skull and the most raised and extreme edges of the gold wings. Paint any leather pouches on the model using Dryad Bark. Shade the leather areas using Nuln Oil. Paint the edges of the leather, pick out any prominent folds using Gorthor Brown. Pick out the sharper corners then with the leather with Steel Legion Drab. Base coat the wax of any purity seals using Mephiston Red, and again 2 thin coats will be needed. Shade this with Nuln Oil. Pick out the raised edges and the centre of the wax with Evil Sunz Scarlet. Pick out then the most extreme highlighted areas with Fire Dragon Bright. Small amounts of this in small dots gives the best effect. Base coat the parchment with Zandri Dust. Shade with Agrax Earthshade, making sure it collects in the deepest recess between the 2 sheets of parchment. With horizontal brush strokes, pick out the raised surfaces of the parchment with Ushabti Bone. The horizontal strokes give it a more of a kind of a paper appearance as opposed to just being a singular layer. Edge highlight with Screaming Skull. Really only just the sharpest edges and corners. To pick out a text-like effect on the parchment, use thinned Abaddon Black and a fine tip brush to do squiggles, simulating writing on the surface of the parchment. Pick out the eye lenses with a base coat of Mephiston Red. paint the front about 50% of the lens using Evil Sun Scarlet. Pick out a smaller area again using Fire Dragon Bright. Pick out the frontmost part of the lens with a dot of Yriel Yellow. To complete the lens, pick out a single dot of white scar at the backmost corner of the lens. To add an extra pop to the black armour, as a final step, pick out any of the most prominent corners with dots of blue horror. Again, very little of this is needed, so keep it to the most extreme areas that you want to draw the attention to, namely on the face. And this is the finished model. If you like this tutorial, please check out the channel for other Warhammer and non-Warhammer painting tutorials, and consider subscribing if you'd like to be kept up to date.